All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning from wherever you're logging in from. My name is Colin Longmore. I'm the Grassroots Outreach and Education Specialist with Network Lobby, and I'm very grateful to be here with you all today for this Teach In webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we will provide a link to the recording to all registrants afterwards. The topic today for today's teach-in is on the filibuster, which has been in the news a lot. We've been hearing a lot about it as well. And we're going to be talking about that today. And this webinar is part of the Faith in Democracy Forum. And we're so thankful to be joined today by a few partner organizations who will be sharing with us today as well. And that's the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW, Faith in Public Life, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, Faithful Democracy, and Network Lobby. So thank you to our organizations for being with us here today for this teach-in. We have some wonderful presenters today who will be representing each of these organizations as well. So I want to give a big shout out to our presenters today who will be sharing. We have Jennifer Ahern from CREW, Dan Nyfelt from Faith in Public Life, Laura Peralta Schulte from Network Lobby, Sister Quincy Howard with Faithful Democracy, and Joshua Bird with the Religious Action Center as well. Each of our presenters today will be sharing about the filibuster, as well as their organization's position and messaging on that topic, and as well as the how they got to that position and that messaging as well. As a brief overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we'll be discussing an overview of the Filibuster Rule. What is the filibuster? Providing a context for all of us as we go then into hearing from Network and RAC and their position on the filibuster and how they got there. We will also then hear messaging from Faith in Public Life and from Faithful Democracy on the filibuster as well. There will be time for questions at the end, so please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we hope that it will be an informative session for everyone. This does take me into a brief little tutorial on Zoom, since this is a webinar and it might be a little bit different on your window, but you can type in your questions on the Q&A button that is on the toolbar on the bottom of your window. And we will get to that during our Q&A session towards the end of our webinar today. We also have closed captioning available, which you can turn on using the CC button, which is also at the bottom of your window. So for all those that might need some closed captioning. All right. So with that, we are going to begin with before we hear from our first presenter, we want to hear a little bit from you, where we're going to share in a moment an anonymous poll where we're going to ask you, what do you think about the filibuster? And you'll have a few choices to respond to be able to see that. So the way that will look, you're going to be able to choose between the choices of on the filibuster, maybe it's I don't know, I'm unsure. I believe that we should keep the filibuster. I believe that we should reform the filibuster, or I believe that we should eliminate the filibuster. So please choose an answer from that poll as the anonymous poll window pops up on your screen right now, and we'll see where we are with all of that. So we'll launch the poll right now. Everyone will be able to see. We'll get some answers right now. All right, so we have some votes coming in. We're past 50% already. Excellent. We almost have everyone voting already, 89%. Thank you all. We get a few more seconds as we have a few more people answering. Excellent. So with that, I will go ahead and share the results of our polling, and I believe you'll all be able to see it. This is right here. So as we share the results of the poll, we see that with 29%, we have folks saying that they don't know much about the filibuster, a little bit unsure. We have 0% for those saying keep it as it is. About 32% of participants on our webinar today say that it should be reformed or modified. And we have about 40% that believe that it should be eliminated. So thank you to all for sharing and for participating in this poll. I think it's great to be able to see the diversity of thoughts and opinions on this. When we hear from our presenters today, we will also hear various positions and messaging on it as well. So we hope that it's informative as well for whatever position that you hold. But with that, we're going to dive into our first presenter today, who will give us an overview of the filibuster rule, a little bit of context for us as we dive into our teach-in today. And that's going to be with Jennifer Ahern, who is the policy director for CREW. And we are grateful to have her here today to help us understand what the filibuster is. And with that, I'll pass it to Jennifer now.
Thanks, Colin, and thank you to everyone for joining. It's great to be with all of you. I will try to do this relatively briefly, and I will also try to do it in relatively plain language. I admit that I'm a lawyer, and so that's a challenge for me. But I will hopefully be able to do this in a way that that won't be too much like stuck in legalese. So here we go. The filibuster, as we currently think of it, is a requirement within the rules of the Senate that 3/5 of the senators must vote affirmatively to end debate on most bills. So that's, and the ending debate part is where you may have heard the word cloture. That's basically what that means. But I want to circle back to some of those to just talk about a few elements of that are worth noting. One is the part that it is a Senate rule. What that means for these purposes is that this is not a law. The filibuster is not a law. It's not from the Constitution. This is a rule that the Senate has created for itself, and it can change that rule over time if it wants to, and it has in fact done so at various times in the past. So that's just a sort of broad context of what is the filibuster. It is a rule of the Senate. The current rule is that 3/5 of senators must vote affirmatively to end debate. So what we're talking about is the transition between a bill that is brought to the floor and when the Senate Majority Leader brings a bill to the floor, that starts debate on the bill. So the filibuster comes into play when we're talking about ending debate on the bill and moving into the process of voting on a bill. And so this is a way to really stop the filibuster is essentially a way to control when things move from the debating process into the voting process. And that is important, I think, to some degree, because it has an impact on how people perceive the filibuster and what they think they're doing when they're filibustering, but also effectively, it means that some bills can essentially be killed before they even reach a vote. So it's a way to not vote on a bill, perhaps, but also a way to prevent a bill from being voted on. So it has that sort of gatekeeping type of impact on what happens in the Senate. And the ultimate sort of consequence of it is that 41 senators can prevent legislation that a majority of senators, 51 senators, would support. Now, I will say that there are already categories of legislation that the filibuster simply doesn't apply to. And so legislation that is related to the federal budget is one category of legislation that simply can't be filibustered. So it may be passed by a majority. Folks know that probably. That particular exclusion is where you may have heard some talk about the Byrd rule or the parliamentarian or some of these more sort of esoteric things. But basically what we're talking about is the question, is a particular piece of legislation sufficiently related to the federal budget? And that's one category of exemptions. legislation related to executive nominations is another category of exemptions. And so that's why you see folks being confirmed to executive branch positions by the Senate without the filibuster being part of that process. So that's basically the very big picture of how the filibuster works right now. And I'll just outline also sort of a big picture way of thinking about potential changes to the filibuster, because that's obviously what we're all here to talk about to some degree. Clearly, one way to, to address this would be simply to eliminate the filibuster so that that rule just doesn't exist anymore, and would be replaced effectively by a majority rule that as soon as a majority votes to move from debate to actual voting, then that bill can move in that direction, which is how things operate for the federal budget and for executive nominations. So obviously you could simply eliminate that. Another way that you could, the other end of the extreme might be just to simply keep it, right? And have that continue. When you talk about modifications to the filibuster, there are a number of different things that have been proposed over the years, and different changes that could be made. So I'll just give you how I think of these in broad categories, because this is where we can particularly end up in the weeds of Senate procedure. So I would think of these as really substantive changes and procedural changes. So substantive changes would be adding another category of things that are exempted from the filibuster rule itself. So the filibuster rule wouldn't change, but there would be an additional exemption added, like the exemption for legislation related to the budget, that would mean that for certain kinds of legislation, you simply don't have to, the filibuster is not in effect. And so, when you hear people in the current discussion talking about a democracy carve out or a voting rights carve out or that kind of thing, that would be generally speaking the sort of type of thing that we'd be talking about, is carving out some types of legislation that the filibuster wouldn't apply to, but the filibuster itself for everything else would remain unchanged. And then you have some other proposals for procedural changes to the filibuster that would really change how is the 60 vote requirement operating in some way. So this is where you might see people talk about returning to the talking filibuster, so that in order to actually, in order for 41 senators to keep legislation from coming to the floor, it's not just that they have a one-time vote and that's the end of it. They actually have to come and speak on the floor in the Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, for those of you who might be familiar with that reference, kind of a way. And so as soon as the 41s in that sort of world, as soon as 41 senators were not willing to come to the floor, then there could be a vote that would immediately move the bill to the floor. There's also been proposals to simply reduce the number of votes that the filibuster permits from 60 to some lower number. And that's been done in the past over time. I think in 1975, the number came down from 67 to 60. And so you could certainly see another reduction in the number, while otherwise keeping the filibuster intact. And then you have other sort of smaller procedural changes as well. And I won't get into the weeds on those, but there are sort of other smaller procedural changes. So that's really the big 30,000 foot view of what the filibuster is, and some of the proposals that have been bandied about over the years to change it. The only other thing that I would say, just in terms of things to be aware of, and I started this at the beginning mentioning this, but I want to sort of emphasize it, is if you're wondering, well, couldn't the Senate make a rule that does X? The answer is yes, almost certainly they could. There are very few, if any, external constraints on the Senate's rules in this case. It's really just a question of how the Senate wants to operate itself. And so, yes, they can probably do that thing that you're thinking about whether they can do. Now, do they want to do it, and it is a good idea, are obviously separate questions. But there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of how the Senate wants to operate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that, again, 30,000 foot view of the filibuster. Certain things like the exemption carve outs is something I guess, like me personally, I hadn't really heard of a lot. So I'm glad you're able to bring in some of those things as well. But thank you again. Again, as we have this context of what the filibuster is, we want to dive in then now to each of the organizations and the representatives that we have from each of the organizations, talking about their positions and their messaging on the filibuster as well. So to begin with that, we're going to first go with Laura Peralta-Schulte, who is the chief lobbyist here at Network Lobby, and she'll be outlining our positions and the reasoning why. So I'll pass it over to Laura now.
Thank you so much. And it is such a blessing to be with everybody today. So there was a process that Network undertook related to how we were going to position ourselves on this issue, because really looking at three different impacts. So I'll just walk you through very briefly what those were. You can't divorce a discussion on the modern use of the filibuster from our perspective from how the filibuster has actually been used as a tool for white supremacy. So when you look at the use of the filibuster, and in particular, the use of the filibuster to block things like civil rights legislation, anti-lynching legislation, it has been a powerful tool, not to support the view of minority rights, but to crush them. And so part of our analysis in terms of what should be the position of Network as it relates to the filibuster was to do a deep dive and to see how it's actually been used to block progress. So that was a very, very important element of our discussion as to where we should be on it. And probably was the strongest consideration for how we came out with the position to completely eliminate the filibuster. The second issue, and it's very related to the looking at the nature of the filibuster, was the question of, how do we get our agenda through? So Network, for those who don't know, is a multi-issue organization. We work on things from related to democracy. We work on justice systems reform, immigration, healthcare, really a whole spectrum of issues. And I'm so glad Jennifer mentioned that some of the issues are carved out of the filibuster rule. So we can get through these special procedures progress on some of our issues. But if you look at, immigration, for example, or a democracy, we will not be able to get action done on those issues without some modifications and or the elimination of the filibuster. So the second piece to know about that is that when you look at what's at stake, who is impacted, in terms of voting rights, it is clear that what we would call forces that are trying to restrict, particularly Black and Brown communities from voting, are tying their future to the filibuster. When we look at immigration and a pathway to citizenship for largely Black and Brown immigrants, we understand that the filibuster is a block. That is the same for justice systems reform, for so much of our agenda. So coming from a multi view in terms of from an issues standpoint, and thinking that a Senate rule, not the Constitution, is the key block to making progress, that was another factor that led us to want to call for the elimination of the filibuster. And lastly, I would just say, there is some might call it prophetic, some might call it the need for a left flank. When we thought through where is our position on the filibuster, part of it was, the idea that we should, because these things will be negotiated, we should take the most aggressive standpoint on something that impacts, the civil rights of millions of Americans. We should be prophetic at this point in time, knowing that Congress is a reactive body, knowing that the goal is to achieve progress on our legislative agenda. And from a perspective of where should we be in this moment, we thought that it was most strategic to be aggressive in calling for elimination, to make sure that there is space to negotiate a remedy that folks can come to agreement on. So I would say for those three reasons, the review of how the tool has been used and how it has been used to crush Black and Brown communities' rights, the idea that we are a multi-issue organization that pragmatically looked and said, we're not going to make progress if we've got to have 60 people voting for these pieces. We need to look for an alternative, and the need to be prophetic and play the role of the left flank to allow for negotiations to move this forward. That was really I think the three pieces that we looked at as we came to the decision that we were going to call for the elimination. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing Network's position, which is on eliminating for the filibuster. With that, first of all, before we go to the next speaker, thank you again for all those sending in questions. Keep sending them in. We will have a time for answering some of these live in our Q&A session. So thank you, and please continue to send those. But we will go now to our next position that we're going to be sharing, and this will be with Joshua Berg, sharing the position of Religious Action Center. Joshua Berg is a 2020-2021 Eisendrath Legislative Assistant at RAC, and we're very happy to have him here so we can share the position as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin, for that very kind introduction. It's so great to be with all of you today. As Colin said, my name is Josh Berg, he's, he, and pronouns, and I'm with the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. And just for some background, if you don't know, the Religious Action Center is the social justice and advocacy arm of the Union for Reform Judaism, which is the largest and the most diverse Jewish movement in North America. We have over 1.8 million members and over 2,000 rabbis in about 850 congregations across all 50 states, as well as Canada. The impetus for the Religious Action Center and for the reform movement establishing an organizational policy on the filibuster is a direct result of us launching a racial justice campaign this past April. This racial justice campaign has several pillars to it, but most relevantly, the federal advocacy pillar of the campaign is focused on securing and protecting every American's freedom to vote. And so when our lay leaders, when our board members were in the research process for this campaign, they heard time and time again, over and over, that if we were serious about passing the For the People Act, if we were serious about passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that we also needed to think seriously about the filibuster and the ways in which the modern day Senate filibuster that we've heard about is an obstructionist tool in the Senate, that it blocks progress on legislation that is actually widely popular and is incredibly necessary for our democracy. So it's sort of that urgency of this moment in particular that brought us to needing to establish an organizational policy on the filibuster. And just by way of understanding how we got to our policy, it's important to know that all of the policy work that the RAC does is mandated by resolutions that our Commission on Social Action and our North American Board pass. So we don't do any policy work that is outside the mandate of positions that have been agreed upon by literally hundreds of leaders within our movement. And so as we launched the campaign and as our leaders had discovered that there's a need to address the filibuster, they then launched into a process of researching and understanding the modern style of filibuster, where it comes from, how it works mechanically, the impact it has, the obstructionist and pretty devastating impact it has on a wide range of legislative agendas. And so in our research, it became clear that reform or elimination was going to be necessary if we were serious about passing protections for our democracy. And we also, Laura spoke to this a little bit, and we share much of the same analysis. we're particularly concerned with the way the filibuster has historically and now in the present been a tool that some have used to preserve racist structures in American society. And we're also concerned about the way it privileges a minority of senators over a majority of senators that the American people elected as the majority in the Senate. So there's a real issue of the very group that is the minority that represents a less than half amount of the American people has power to block the agenda of the majority of the American people. That's a fundamental issue in a democracy. And at the same time, we don't need to look back too far in our history to see the serious dangers that could be posed by filibuster elimination. So for example, in 2013, then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid eliminated the filibuster on presidential nominations, except on Supreme Court nominations, to help President Obama get through some of his nominations that were being held up in the Senate. But then, of course, once Republicans retook the Senate and controlled the White House, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell promptly eliminated the filibuster on Supreme Court nominations as well. And this led to the appointment of several justices, namely Brett Kavanaugh, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett, who were probably farther right ideologically than would have otherwise been possible if the filibuster had been left in place. And we know that these appointments of these justices represents a serious ideological tipping point in the court's history. And so our leaders were deeply fearful for what might happen to so many of our progressive policy victories that we've won over the years, should the filibuster be totally eliminated and should a filibusterless Senate be in the hands of folks that don't share our particular worldview and legislative agenda. For example, it was the filibuster that prevented the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, from being repealed. Just simply without the filibuster, we would have lost the ACA. But because of the filibuster, it was able to be maintained. And so in the end, we believe that in a healthy democracy, we must correctly balance the needs of the majority with the need of minority rights and voices. And the filibuster in its current form is simply representative of this balance being disrupted in recent years. I'm going to speak in a moment about the reform movement's policy position that we came to, but I also just want to speak about values for a moment as well. Jewish tradition celebrates the meaningful exchange of ideas and has a tremendous amount of respect for minority viewpoints. In the Talmud, which is an important Jewish text in Jewish tradition, we learn that the Jewish law is decided in favor of those that humbly preserve the opposing opinion in their teachings. And also, if you've ever looked at a page of Talmud, if you haven't, I encourage you after this webinar to get on Google Images and look up a page of Talmud. You'll find that the majority opinion is presented in the middle, and then surrounding it on all sides is commentary and dissenting voices. And so in Jewish tradition, we recognize wholeheartedly that there may be truth and wisdom in opposing views on many issues as well. So ultimately, our leaders came to a reform position. We believe that filibuster reform, as opposed to elimination, would contribute to dialogue and has the potential to rebalance majority and minority rights in the Senate. The resolution, which we ultimately passed, supports policies such as returning to a talking filibuster and other policies that put the onus on the minority to produce the votes necessary to block a bill and to actually have to explain their opposition to a bill that they want to filibuster. And we also do support the lowering of the number of votes necessary to overcome a filibuster in certain cases. So for example, we would support a carve out for voting rights issues. So all in all, our position is somewhere in the middle of keeping the filibuster and fully eliminating it. We're concerned about what full elimination could mean in sort of a long view historical lens. And we also know that something needs to change with regard to the filibuster in the current moment, so that we can pass important protections for our democracy, and so we can pass a number of our other legislative priorities. So we think there's ground in the middle for reform, things like the talking filibuster, things like carve outs for critical issues like voting rights, that can balance the needs of passing legislation on the most pressing issues of our time with ensuring that we don't end up being hurt in the long run by that need as well. So I think I'll stop there and I'll pass it back to Colin.
Thank you, Josh, for sharing the position from RAC as well. With that, we're gonna go next to our next presenter, which is Dan Nyfelt, who is the Director of Messaging and Online Engagement with Faith in Public Life.
Hi, Colin, and hi, everybody. Thank you so much. As he said, I'm Director of Messaging and Online Engagement at Faith in Public Life. We're a nationwide network of faith leaders working together for justice and the common good. And we're grateful not only to Network and Faithful Democracy, but also to Crew and the RAC. I feel honored to be here today for this important discussion. And Colin, if I could ask you to put my slides up now, I'll start talking a little bit about Faith in Public Life's approach to messaging on this issue. Thank you. All right. So you should be able to see a slide now that says FPL's core principles of messaging. I put this up because this is an approach that we take toward really all of our policy work. And it's especially important to remember this with the filibuster, which talked about in isolation on its own sounds pretty arcane, and also has a very low level of understanding and recognition within the population at large. I saw in the poll that was put up right at the beginning that roughly around a third of us are still forming opinions or don't know much about the filibuster. And in the general population, it's a lot more than 1/3 of people, a lot more than 1/3 of people who are unfamiliar. So with that in mind, just wanted to lay out that we focus on values rather than on process. We seek to inspire rather than to win a point-by-point debate, and to humanize issues rather than make utilitarian arguments that commodify people, and to strive to hit clarity rather than make the world's most comprehensive statements. It's important to consider all factors when we come to policy position. It's not feasible to effectively and clearly communicate a large, comprehensive, very nuanced position in the realm of places like media and brief conversations. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, I did notice that people have a few different viewpoints on whether to reform the filibuster or to eliminate the filibuster. Though I was very relieved to see that 0 people on here wanted to just keep it as is. The messaging that I'm going to go over really speaks to the fact that even if we have different positions about exactly what the fate should be, that we're all rowing in the same direction when you look at the big picture. And what we lay out here specifically refers to elimination of the filibuster because that's Faith in Public Life's position, but it could be easily adapted to a position that is about that is about reforming. And frankly, we might have to do that anyway because yesterday you might have seen that at a town hall meeting, President Biden said that eliminating the filibuster would create chaos in the Senate, which to me kind of lets the agents of chaos off the hook. But that's a topic for another day. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I always like to outline the structure of our messages before just putting them out there. Our approach to the filibuster is on here on this slide. Leading with values. Before we say anything about the filibuster itself, we want to ground what we say in the values that motivate why we're working on the issues that we're working on at all. And then second, we want to talk about the specific issues that we care about that the filibuster is blocking. Because we want to eliminate the filibuster or reform it, not because we want to eliminate it, but because it's what stands in the way of the things we really care about, like protecting the freedom to vote, protecting the equal dignity of people who are LGBT, putting up citizenship building a path to citizenship for people who are undocumented if that doesn't make it through in the reconciliation bill. We want to make sure to set the big picture of values and then the big picture of the policies we seek before we even get to the filibuster. So values, then the policy, big picture, then we brand the filibuster for what it really is. And I'm really glad to hear both Network and the RAC put out a sort of a racial equity lens on what on the damage the filibuster does and the unjust ends that it so often serves. So third thing is to brand the filibuster, then do that call to action. And that call to action means eliminate it, or that call to action means we need to reform it so that it doesn't take 60 votes. And we need to reform it so that voting rights for the minority cannot be vetoed by a Senate minority. So after all those things, then it's good to close an argument with reiterating the value statement and the policy big picture. So this is our roadmap to how we communicate, whether it's speaking off the cuff, whether it's writing an op-ed, whether it's giving a speech at a rally, or having a conversation in your congregation, whatever it may be. These are the elements that we recommend, not only on the filibuster, but in general when we're speaking about policy issues. So with all that in mind, next slide, please. Here's our full extended faith in public life message on eliminating the filibuster. And I'll read it aloud and then unpack it just a little bit before going to the next slide. No matter what we look like or where we come from, we expect our elected leaders to pass policies that protect our freedoms and help us all thrive. Congress has a moral duty to defend our freedom to vote, honor the equality of every person, and ensure that every family can live in dignity. But a faction of senators is blocking popular solutions with the filibuster, the same loophole that segregationists use to block anti-lynching laws and civil rights. The people of faith will not accept this. It's time for the Senate majority to abolish the filibuster. This is a turning point for our nation, and our democracy is on the line. So that line where I said it's time for the Senate majority to abolish the filibuster could just as easily be used to say it's time for the Senate majority to reform the filibuster so that a minority of senators cannot veto protection of our freedom to vote. So that's the full, lengthy, extensive filibuster message. And we have a shorter one on the next slide because you don't always have a chance to speak 7 sentences about an issue. This is a tighter one that really hits all the same notes and follows the same structure. Congress has a moral duty to pass policies that defend our freedom to vote and ensure that we can all thrive. Those are value statements. People of faith refuse to let a faction of senators use a loophole from Jim Crow's playbook to block overwhelmingly popular policies that uphold human dignity and our democracy. It's time for the Senate majority to abolish the filibuster and defend our democracy. So whether you're speaking at length or whether you're speaking a little tighter, it's really the same elements. Moral duty to defend our values with policies that help us all be free and thrive. Brand that filibuster as something that is used as a tool of white supremacist obstructions that gets in the way of the things that we need, and then make that call to action and close with the defense of democracy. This is a formula that, number one, makes your message really easy to come up with in a short amount of time, and number two, speaks to the bigger picture because people don't care about procedure. Like if you look at people who vote but don't read 4 different newspapers in the same day, people want results. People want their lives to be better. People want their elected representatives to do their jobs rather than get bogged down in policies. So it's so important to keep the big picture in mind, and it's so important to be grounding what we say in values. And that is all that I have as far as slides. and I'll stay on for any question and answer about the messaging. Thanks so much, Colin.
Thank you, Dan. With that, we're going to go to our last presenter sharing their messaging, and it's Sister Quincy Howard, from Coordinating Director with Faithful Democracy.
Thanks, Colin. I'll make this quick. So with Faithful Democracy, we have something of a luxury that we are pretty singularly focused on democracy reforms. That includes the For the People Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and DC statehood. So we really also include several different faith-based advocacy organizations and congregations that have taken different stances on the filibuster. Network and the RAC are both partners of ours. And we also have organizations and congregations that cannot take an advocacy position on the filibuster because it doesn't fit within their sort of policy portfolios. So they have to navigate these waters very carefully. And we are focused on holding that space for everyone in a way that has integrity. So what we have decided to do for our messaging related to the filibuster is to stay focused on the end goal. You've heard many of my colleagues here talk about how it's so important to continuously come back to the substance of the policies that you are trying to get passed. That is our primary strategy with Faithful Democracy. We look at the substance of these democracy reforms. I think a quote from Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock is perfect to sort of get across what our key messaging strategy would be. And he says, no Senate rule should overrule the integrity of our democracy. And we must find a way to pass democracy reform. So that is at the core of our messaging. It does not mean that we don't acknowledge that the filibuster is the singular hurdle right now. In fact, the For the People Act is stalled in the Senate because it has been filibustered and has not been debated. And we also do not shy away from the really sordid, racially fraught history and abuse of the filibuster and its problematic nature in the Senate. And in fact, I'll share our 2-pager on filibuster reform that does get at the sort of anti-democratic dynamics that are at play with the way that the filibuster is currently used in the Senate. So it does also tie into our overarching message of democracy reforms that make our democracy more true to the ideals of representation. However, we recognize that if we get distracted by a procedural rule rather than the substance of what matters to us, which is creating a truer democracy that is fairer and inclusive, then we ultimately might get stuck talking about a procedural rule. That's not where we want to be. So we continuously pull it back to the substance. I would also say, as you'll see in our 2-pager, if you read that we feel safe in, if you look at the poll that we took earlier, even the people who didn't know much, the third of the people who didn't know much and wanted to learn more about the filibuster rule, they did not click leave it as it is, because everyone across the board understands that this rule is functionally problematic. And so we feel safe in saying that the filibuster needs to be reformed, something needs to be done, and that we need creative minds in the Senate to get together and figure out a path to passage for these democracy reform bills. So it is not shying away from the issue. It is recognizing the issue, the problematic nature of the rule, and it is also staying true to what our ultimate goal is, which is passing democracy reforms. So I would just encourage folks that if you don't necessarily want to come down hard on a reform or elimination, you can really continue to focus on your bill and still acknowledge the problematic nature of the filibuster rule. And that is a message that has integrity and can be carried forward in a true way, and also hopefully can help others think about the bigger issue of how our democracy functions and the different ways that it could be improved. And with that, I will pass it back to Colin.
Excellent. Thank you, Sister Quincy. So we've heard a lot from each of our representatives and their organizations on their positions on the messaging and speaking about the filibuster. And what we want to do in our last little bit of time together is to go into a little bit of a Q&A. We've received a bunch of awesome questions from everyone on the call. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. So I'd invite our panelists to maybe put on their video as well, so we can see everyone, and we'll throw some questions to some folks that are directed specifically at some, and then some that if anyone just wants to jump in on as well, we can answer too. But one of the questions that we do have is related to cloture, as we were talking about at the very beginning. And the question comes from Fred saying, why does the filibuster rule that sets 60% needed to stop debate actually stop discussion on an issue? And so I don't know if maybe Jennifer or if someone else would like to share a little bit on that question.
Sure, I'll give that a try. The filibuster rule is the rule that is designed to move the sort of Senate process from the debating process to the voting stage. So it does that because that is what its function is in the Senate's, sort of process. And that is not to say that that the Senate can't necessarily come back to things if they fail at a vote process. You could go back, you could change, the legislation and return to that. So it's not necessarily the end of discussion on an issue, but it is the end of debate on the issue in that moment. And then the other thing that I guess I would just flag in respect to that is that there is sort of as a realistic matter, a limited amount of time that the Senate has to do things in any given year. And so Senate floor time, as they call it, is very valuable. And so folks in the Senate are generally not inclined to spend a lot of time debating things that can't pass. And so there's always a push and pull on the Senate, within the Senate to try to make sure that debates are happening, but that they're only happening in a way that's useful, so that the Senate can move on to other things when the usefulness of those debates are no longer there. So I hope that answers Fred's question.
Colin, can I just add, there's a practical dimension right now too. We have a new administration. So it's a new administration that doesn't have staff in place. So this does kind of buttresses what Jen is saying. Not only are they trying to get substance through, they've got to get Biden appointees through. So it definitely shuts it down and leads to a very pragmatic discussion amongst leadership as what has legs. So in terms of democracy, if we can continue to see this pattern for this, or say, for example, voting rights, at some point they step away from it, and that is the true risk.
Thank you, Jennifer and Laura, for sharing that. There were a few questions, multiple ones, and we've answered them individually, but questions about how many votes does it take to eliminate or to reform the filibuster Senate rules. And I know there's an answer on there where it's a simple majority of 51, but I don't know if there's anything else to add to that.
No, not really. I mean, I guess the only thing is that I would also add to that for folks who are, sort of wondering about this. For historical reasons, basically, the House votes on its rules at the beginning of every session, every 2-year session that it has. And so these issues sort of come up and present themselves frequently for the House. That's not true for the Senate. And so basically, a majority of the senators have to sort of affirmatively decide that they're going to make an effort to change a rule. So you don't have that. That doesn't change necessarily the votes that you need, but it's just sort of a realistic difference between the House and the Senate that changes how people sometimes think about the rules and how hard or easy it is to get the rules changed.
Excellent, thank you. We do have a question on the Josh, you had mentioned some of the downsides of getting rid of the filibuster. And one of the questions is seeing if any of those downsides are worse than the current situation that we have. And I don't know if you'd like to comment a little bit on that idea.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's difficult because it's hard for any of us to look into the future and predict the outcome of elections, let alone what that elected majority might do with that mandate. And so I think the thing that we can do, and this is what the leaders in the reform movement were doing, was they looked back at history and they said, in cases where the filibuster has been eliminated, what has the result been? And I think that the best example is that example around presidential nominations in the Supreme Court, that the elimination of the filibuster on presidential nominations led to the elimination of the filibuster on Supreme Court nominations and led to a pretty dramatic tipping point ideologically for the Supreme Court that is going to have really drastic and extreme ramifications for so many of the issues we care about for years to come in ways that we are not going to be happy about. And that impact people's lives in very real ways. So I think those are sort of the possibilities that I think of. It's hard to predict anything in the future, but I think we can look back and see that there are serious threats, and it's essentially a choice about balancing things that we know we need now versus things that we know could happen in the future. And everybody's going to have a different choice there, frankly.
Yeah.
I see it a little bit differently there in that in the analysis specifically, which is like, I wouldn't assume that if Harry Reid hadn't eliminated, the filibuster on judicial noms, that Mitch McConnell in turn would not have eliminated it. So I think, it's important to make sure that we don't imply that there's cause and effect when there's not. So that's that kind of, I was debating whether, I saw this question, I was debating whether or not to try and answer it because it is really, really hard. And Josh raises a really good point there. So I think, well, from a messaging perspective, I always like to look at what's in front of us because people can, it's easy to make your best guess, and the best guess can also lead to catastrophic thinking that inhibits action in the present. So I want to validate where the question comes from, but also take a caution in the type of, on the paths that that can lead down, both in messaging as well as thinking out positions.
Excellent. Thank you. We do have some questions about the budget and budget reconciliation. And I'd like to see if anyone would like to, I guess, just comment on that. Specifically, one of the questions we had was when and how does reconciliation work, and maybe how does it tie in with things like the American Rescue Plan, another legislation that's really, I guess, pertinent in these times. But would anyone like to comment on how budget reconciliation would work?
And I don't know if you want to go through the structure. I would just say that, it is a very complicated structure that was agreed to. Oh gosh, was it the budget? I want to say the Budget Act of 1974. And so from a pragmatic way, for this audience, I just want folks to be aware that there is a referee. And there is this position in the Senate, it is called the Senate parliamentarian, that basically is the judge of whether or not a policy can move forward through the reconciliation process. And there are a set of criteria for that process. It's very complicated, so I don't want to take anybody down a rabbit hole. I would just say that with respect to what is happening in this environment, we are hopeful that the leadership in the House and Senate are going to put forth very robust plans that are full of all the things that many of us on this webinar totally support in terms of building back better. I would say as advocates in different spaces, we're also trying to see if we can't weave some of our objectives in that can't pass filibuster. And again, I want to bring up the issue of the pathway to citizenship. It's very hard to see a situation that we can get the Dream and Promise Act or these bills through without really having very serious draconian enforcement, terror bills attached to it in this Congress, in this political environment. So we are trying to, as best we can, encourage leadership to include things like a pathway to citizenship in the package, create the political momentum. But ultimately, the challenge with this process is that we know that the Republicans will fight that. We know that there's going to be a debate where literally both sides are going to put evidence forward to say that it should be in budget reconciliation and that it meets the rules, but the referee is going to make a call. So again, these are all processes constructed by an institution. There's no reason why these processes can't change to reflect the values that we're talking about in this conversation. So with that, I will stop.
As another question that we have, looking at the For the People Act, when or if Republicans get back in power, can Mitch McConnell reverse the For the People Act?
I can try to jump in on that one. Reversing the For the People Act would require sort of the same thing that any piece of legislation requires, right? Which is both the House and the Senate to pass it and the president to sign it. So Mitch McConnell himself definitely cannot reverse the For the People Act, even if he becomes majority leader again. Now, that's not to say that if the Republicans had a trifecta, where they had the presidency and the House and the Senate, or even if they didn't, that the For the People Act couldn't be reversed, but it wouldn't be a simple flipping of the switch if the control of the Senate flips in the next election, let's say.
And just to jump in, I think that sort of question points to some of the issues that leaders in the reform movement identified with elimination. You could end up with a situation where you have a legislative pendulum and it creates a little bit of unpredictability in legislation, because depending on who's in power, it just keeps swinging back and forth.
And I would like to add just one more thing to that, is that we know that the For the People Act has broad popular support among the public across the political spectrum. So there is an impetus for Congress and the president to pass this bill. If you look at it from the flip side of trying to use a simple majority in the future to repeal an extremely popular bill like the For the People Act that opens up our democracy, well, you can just imagine that that would not be an easy step to take.
I would just add one thing that might seem a little bit off topic, but really is important to remember and is relevant, is that this is the third administration where I've been doing this faith-based advocacy, and there's a giant burst of lawmaking in a new president's first Congress, and the more groundwork we've laid that they would have to undo, that's more work that we're packing into a ticking clock situation. So it's really important to remember that things can be undone. Things that we do now can be undone. The Affordable Care Act was toast when there was a Republican trifecta in 2017. And I just say that just by way of wanting everybody here to feel empowered. And that the things we do now, that we pass now affirmatively, can endure, can make a difference. And I think that's why we're all here today, and why we're all in this movement, in this fight.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say thank you to all of our presenters, of our speakers today. We are getting to the end of our presentation, of our teach-in. We hope you continue to enjoy the Faith in Democracy Forum. And again, if you have not done so, to call your senators and to urge them to support the For the People Act and all of that. But again, a thank you to all of our panelists for being here today, for their sharing. Thank you to everyone in the audience for the questions that have been submitted. And we hope to see you soon and continue in this work that we all are doing. So we thank you again.
Bye-bye.
That was fun, Colin.